Last year, almost 1/3 of Americans in their later 60s were still working. In France, to cite a nation whose statist tradition actually doesn't come from the left, it goes back to the Bourbon kings, in France, just 4% of the French in the later 60s are either working or looking for work. So the young are not doing well in America, and comparatively the old are not doing well in America. What about low-wage workers? There was a survey recently undertaken by the National Employment Law Project and a whole slew of foundations and universities. If I were to list them all, that would be my whole 8 minutes. Of 4,400 low-wage workers in New York, Chicago, and LA, 26% of them were illegally paid less than the minimum wage in just the preceding week from the time the surveyor asked them the question. So, what kind of shifts in labor and capital do I hope the Obama administration will affect? Well, one would be enforcement of things like violations of minimum wage laws. I think if that would have to be a reasonable assessment of one of the raison d'etre of the Labor Department. Secondly, I think it's absolutely essential that Congress pass, something they will turn to after they pass whatever version of health care they pass, that Congress pass labor law reform that enables workers to join unions, which is now excruciatingly difficult in the private sector. Over the last 2 decades, a huge gap has opened between the rate of unionization in the public sector and the rate of unionization in the private sector. This is not because postal workers are socialists and FedEx workers are capitalists, or more to the point, perhaps the UPS workers are socialists and FedEx workers are capitalists. It's because the law is so weak that private sector workers seeking a union essentially have no protection. And I would hope this law would include a provision for binding arbitration, which does not, by the way, have to be imposed by a government arbitrator. They could do, as Arlen Specter has suggested, what they do in baseball. Each side presents a last best final offer on every contentious point, and the arbitrator picks one or the other, whichever he or she thinks is more reasonable. But I must tell you, there was a modest little quantitative survey done by John Paul Ferguson and Thomas Cochin at MIT of 22,000 unionization campaigns from 1989 to 2004, and it showed that even when workers won an election, won a contract, they were able to get a contract just 56% of the time, which means, by process of subtraction, 44% of the time it was heads, management wins, tails, workers lose. Finally, I want to talk a little about, I want to cite the most maybe prolific member of the conservative bar in the United States. Well, certainly one of the most distinguished, unquestionably the most prolific, federal judge Richard Posner, who in his recent book, A Failure of Capitalism, doesn't place the blame on Wall Street, doesn't place the blame on workers, doesn't place the blame on regulators, but he says simply it's capitalism itself. Read his September article in the New Republic on Keynes's general theory, which he finally read after all these years, proclaiming that he is now a Keynesian and that he believes, along with Keynes, that an economy can reach an equilibrium with a high level of involuntary unemployment. And fortunately, that's his word, not mine, fortunately, a government can offset the decline in private consumption and investment in a recession or a depression by increasing public investment. Now, haven't we already done that? Haven't we increased public investment here? Didn't the government just create a $787 billion stimulus? Not really. Let me explain. About $146 billion of that money is for the out years, 2011 and on. So let's subtract that from what's going on right now. I mean, it's real money, but it's not happening right now. But then there's another thing that is seldom considered that a group called the Federalist Society should really contemplate, and that is the way federalism works during a recession. There's an old algebra problem, and I say old because it was an algebra problem I had, hence it was old. There was an old algebra problem that dealt with filling a bathtub on which someone had neglected to stop the drain. So if you know the rate that water comes out of the tap and the rate that water drains out of the drain and the size of the tub, you can calculate the water level at, you know, if you do X, Y, and Z. That is not a really good way to fill a tub, and it's not a really good way for a nation to deal with a recession. It is exactly what we do. Because while the federal government has been putting money into the economy, the total, I have a piece on this coming out in the American Prospect on Monday, the total of state and local government budget shortfalls, which it makes up for either by hiking taxes, which is the opposite of stimulative, or cutting services, which is the opposite of stimulus, is $365 billion over the same two-year period, 2009, 2010. So money is fungible. Government is stimulating the economy, and government is anti-stimulating the economy at one and the same time. Why do we have higher employment than our counterparts in other nations that are going through this recession? And Paul Krugman has a column on that today. But I want to say that this is a factor, that instead of spending 2.6% of GDP on a stimulus, this is what the TARP nominally comes to, take out the money not being spent in this two-year period, take out the money that's taken out of the economy by government, but it's state and local government, and it's down to just under 1% of GDP, which is the level that we were criticizing other nations for having too small a stimulus. There's a lot government needs to do to rebalance this economy. Damon will deal with this more. But basically, if we don't alter relations between government, business, and labor, if we don't increase counter-cyclical spending when there's no other way to give the economy a boost, and I point out to you that every government in the world has done this, regardless of their nominal ideology, because it is the only way when an economy has totally tanked to get it going again. If we don't increase our government commitment to research and development, if we don't have the government use its purchasing power to bolster domestic manufacturing so that when we give $1.5 billion to a Texas wind farm, it isn't creating 30 jobs to keep that wind farm going here and 2,000 manufacturing jobs in China, which builds wind turbines. That's a hell of a use for our stimulus project. If we continue to slip behind our competitor nations in this increasingly globalized economy, well, I think that's something that nobody either on the left, the center, or the right of the American political spectrum can reasonably desire. Thanks.
As Harold noted, the statistics are grim. Recent efforts to try to stimulate the economy have been anemic. So Amity will speak up and talk about how it worked back in the 1930s when statistics were even more grim, but the government response was far more intense and robust and long-lasting.